The spirit of man is just like the body, or much like the body. The body serves as a window for the soul to peer into the physical world. It collects information from the physical world by means of our five senses, and then relays it to our soul, which in turn learns and analyzes the information. The soul then responds to the physical world through the body, which can touch and talk and interact with physical entities. Without the body, the soul would not be able to communicate or interact with the physical world. But what about the spirit of man? First of all, the spirit is not the soul. These are two different parts of the human design. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 23, the Apostle Paul mentions that the whole being of a person is made of a body, a soul, and a spirit. Also in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12, the soul and the spirit are mentioned as two entities that can be distinguished by the Word of God. Some people confuse the soul and the spirit as being the same thing because they're both spiritual parts of man. However, they're very different. Confusing the soul and the spirit as being the same thing because they're both spiritual is like confusing arms and legs because they're both physical. The spirit is the window for the soul into the spiritual world. This should be fairly easy to grasp if you relate to how the body allows the soul to interact with the physical world. The spirit of man enables our soul to interact with the spiritual world. The spirit has spiritual senses similar to our physical senses. In fact, Jesus illustrates this in Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 24. When he told of a rich man who died and went to hell, and a beggar who died and went to heaven. In verse 23, Jesus says that the rich man lift up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried out and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water, and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. The imagery in this illustration is very revealing. Remember that the rich man died physically. He was buried, and he had no physical body in hell. But in hell, he lifted up his eyes. What eyes are those? They're certainly not his physical eyes. Notice that he recognized Abraham and Lazarus. How was this possible? There must have been some distinguishing characteristics about these men that could be discerned spiritually. Notice, too, that the rich man experienced the sensations of touch and emotional torment, the heat and pain of fire, as well as the dryness of thirst. In addition, he was able to communicate with Abraham. They actually carried on a two-way dialogue, speaking and hearing. And remember that they did all of this without physical bodies. The senses of the spirit and the body are similar because they're the same thing. They're really the same in many ways. This is because the energies and forces of creation are the same. The physical creation is the spiritual creation that we can detect with our five senses. This is to say, the physical and the spiritual worlds are actually not two different worlds, but rather are the same world, or the same creation. The senses possessed by our spirit are not functional, or at least not to any degree that we're aware of during our physical life. The very small portion of the spiritual creation that we can detect is called the physical world. Much of what we now call physical, or the physical world, would have been considered spiritual at one time, only because we could not detect it. However, it's just as real before we knew about it as it is now that we interact with it. This would include such things as gamma waves, radio waves, pitches of sound that are too low or too high for us to detect, odors that are too faint for us to know of their presence, etc. Technology has expanded our ability to explore and discover phenomena that otherwise would be beyond our normal means of detecting them. Like visible light in the spectrum of electromagnetic energy, the physical world is a very tiny glimpse into the creation that God has created. Once removed from the limitations of the physical body, the senses of the spirit will be experienced in the same way that we experience our physical senses. As I mentioned before, the energies and forces of creation are the same, but the detection capabilities of the senses will be greatly increased in our spirit. This is why the rich man lifted up his eyes in hell and saw Abraham, and was able to carry on a conversation with Abraham with the same sensations of hearing, feeling, and talking. Obviously, these men were not interacting with physical senses, physical eyes, ears, mouths, etc. The imagery in this illustration shows us that there are very real spiritual senses, and that the ability to interact in the spiritual world is not much different than our experience in the physical world. We don't know what kind of spiritual eyes we have, or will have, or how these spiritual senses work, but we do know that they exist. Likewise, we don't know if there are even more forces and forms of energies that we'll detect later on in our spirit. So then we can say that the spirit is to the soul in the spiritual world what the body is to the soul in the physical world. The spirit allows the soul to interact with the spiritual world, just as the body allows the soul to interact with the physical world. Unlike the body, the spirit is immortal, meaning that it continues to exist. Whereas the body dies and decays into the dust of the earth, the spirit continues with the soul. This is indicated by the ability of the rich man to interact with Abraham. Their spirits possess the senses which made this communication possible. After death, at the resurrection, we'll receive a new glorified body to take the place of our mortal physical body. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 35 through 50, describe this new body, saying in verse 44, "It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body." There's a natural body and there's a spiritual body. In verse 38, it says, "But God giveth it a body as it hath pleased him, and to every seed his own body." And in verse 42 it says, "So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown in corruption, it is raised in incorruption." We receive a new righteous body at the resurrection. In contrast, the spirit is already made righteous at the moment of salvation, when a new Christian is born again spiritually. This body, soul, and spirit concept of the human design is a nice, simple, biblically based model that can be used to explain passages in the Bible and to gain insights into theological questions. Understanding the difference between the soul and the spirit resolves common confusions and questions.